They mocked him, humiliated him, pushed him around, but they had no idea who they were messing with. The bus ride to Lincoln Heights, Missouri, was long and quiet. Dorian leaned against the window, watching the scenery shift from crowded streets to suburban neighborhoods where every house looked like a copy of the last. It wasn't his first time being the new kid, but this move felt different. His mum had taken a better job, and his uncle had told him to see it as a fresh start. But fresh starts didn't exist when you looked like him in a town like this. The moment he stepped onto Ridgemont High's campus, he felt it. The pause in conversation when he walked past. The way some of the students glanced at him, then looked away like they hadn't just been staring. The teachers were polite, almost overly so. Their smiles a little too tight, their voices just a bit too careful. Dorian didn't react. He'd been here before. The first few periods went by without much issue. He took his seat, answered when called on, and kept his focus on the work. But by lunch, the feeling of being watched had settled in like an itch beneath his skin. Tray in hand, he scanned the cafeteria for a place to sit. Most tables were already full, groups locked in conversations that didn't include him. A few students exchanged looks, whispering. Then he spotted an empty seat near a guy who seemed too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. Dorian had barely set his tray down when a voice cut through the noise. "You lost?" He turned. A blond guy with an easy smirk and too much confidence leaned back in his chair, a few others at his table watching with amusement. Dorian exhaled slowly. "Didn't know I needed a map." The guy chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here." Dorian caught the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken part of that sentence. He met the guy's stare, his expression unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something else behind it. Amusement, interest, maybe something else. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man." Dorian didn't say anything, just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was just the beginning, but what started as a few looks and whispers was about to turn into something much worse. At first, it was just little things. A few side comments in the hallways, whispered loud enough for him to hear. Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last. Nothing he hadn't heard before. Dorian ignored it. He wasn't here to entertain their ignorance. But Bryce wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. Bryce Tanner had the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one would ever check him. His dad owned half the car dealerships in town, and his crew followed him like he was some kind of royalty. Quarterback. Student body golden boy. The kind of guy who got away with anything. And for whatever reason, Bryce had decided that Dorian being at Ridgemont was a problem. The first real test came at Dorian's locker. He was swapping out his books when a sharp bump knocked him forward. His shoulder hit the metal, the sound echoing down the hall. "Oops," Bryce said, his voice all fake innocence. "Didn't see you there." Dorian didn't react. He finished grabbing his notebook and shut his locker. Kept his movements slow, controlled. If he gave them nothing, they'd get bored. Bryce laughed. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool, real cool." Dorian turned, looked at him, not angry, not scared, just looking. For a second, Bryce's smirk flickered. Then one of his friends, Nick or maybe Kyle, they all blended together, muttered something, and Bryce grinned again. "Catch you later, new guy." Dorian watched them walk away. The hallway noise returned. That was the first time. The second time, it was in the cafeteria. Dorian was heading toward the trash cans when a foot shot out. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. His body jolted forward, but he caught himself before he could fall. Laughter. Bryce held up his hands. "Relax, man. It was a joke." Dorian didn't say anything. He didn't look at him. He just stepped over Bryce's foot and kept walking. More laughter. Someone muttered, "Too easy." Dorian clenched his jaw. His uncle's voice echoed in his head. "A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark." He exhaled. Let it go. But that wasn't enough for them. Because the third time, The third time, Bryce made sure it wasn't just a joke. And that's when things changed. It was after school, and Dorian had just finished up in the library. Most of the students were already gone, the parking lot half empty. He wasn't in a rush. His mum wouldn't be home from work for a few hours, and he didn't mind taking his time. As he stepped outside, he heard voices. Too familiar. "Hey, new guy!" Dorian barely had time to react before something smacked against his back. Hard. He staggered forward, catching himself before he hit the pavement. Laughter. He turned slowly. Bryce stood there, flanked by Nick, Kyle, and a couple of other guys whose names didn't matter. Bryce was still holding his drink cup, the last few drops dripping from his fingers. "Damn, my bad," Bryce said, not even trying to sound sorry. "Didn't see you there." Dorian glanced down. His hoodie was splattered with soda, ice cubes scattered at his feet. Silence stretched between them. Other students lingering in the lot had stopped to watch. Dorian inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Bryce smirked. "Come on, man. Say something." Dorian didn't. He just started to walk past him. That's when Bryce shoved him. It wasn't playful. It wasn't just a joke. It was forceful, meant to provoke. Dorian stumbled back a step. His breath was calm. His fingers flexed at his sides. Bryce laughed. "What, you scared?" Nick stepped forward, grinning. "Nah, man, he's just soft." Dorian had spent his whole life hearing "walk away." He could hear his uncle's voice in his head. "Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want." But right now, Bryce wasn't looking for an easy laugh. He wasn't just playing around. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove something. Dorian took one last deep breath. Then he set down his backpack. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You got something to say now?" Dorian didn't answer. He just rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. "Man, you..." That was as far as he got. Dorian moved. One step in. Quick. Clean. A left feint. Just enough to make Bryce react. Then a sharp right hook straight to his ribs. The sound was sickening. Bryce's breath shot out in a choked gasp as his body folded. But Dorian wasn't done. A pivot. An uppercut. Perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back, and before he could even think about staying on his feet, his legs gave out. He hit the pavement hard. Silence. Nick and the others stared, mouths open. Dorian stepped back, adjusting his hoodie, his breath steady, controlled. Bryce groaned, rolling onto his side. Dorian finally spoke. "You done?" Bryce didn't answer. He just coughed. Dorian looked at the others. "Anyone else?" No one moved. Dorian grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He walked away without another word. But what happened in that parking lot wasn't over. It was just the beginning. By the next morning, the entire school knew. Dorian didn't have to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said everything. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore. They were different. Some were impressed. Some were nervous. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce wasn't in school. That part didn't surprise him. Taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something you bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle, they kept their distance. Dorian walked into class like nothing had happened, sat down, pulled out his notebook, business as usual. But that didn't mean people were done talking. At lunch, as he moved through the cafeteria, conversations quieted when he passed. People whispered. A few nodded like they suddenly respected him. Some freshmen, kids who hadn't even spoken to him before, acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. "Damn, didn't know new guy had hands," someone muttered as he walked by. "Bryce had it coming," another voice added. "Heard he's not coming back for a week." Dorian ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then, as he sat down, he heard something else. "He's just another violent thug." The words were soft, but not soft enough. Dorian turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she smelled something bad, looked away when she realized he'd heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. But he didn't regret it. Bryce had gone looking for a fight. Dorian just made sure he got one. Still, the weight of it all sat on him. He had spent years training, years controlling himself, years walking away. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? But Dorian was about to learn that real strength wasn't just about throwing a punch. It was about what came next. By the next morning, the entire school knew. Dorian didn't have to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said everything. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore. They were different. Some were impressed. Some were nervous. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce wasn't in school. That part didn't surprise him. Taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something you bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle? They kept their distance. Dorian walked into class like nothing had happened. Sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business as usual. But that didn't mean people were done talking. At lunch, as he moved through the cafeteria, conversations quieted when he passed. People whispered. A few nodded like they suddenly respected him. Some freshmen, kids who hadn't even spoken to him before, acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. Damn, didn't know new guy had hands, someone muttered as he walked by. Bryce had it coming, another voice added. Heard he's not coming back for a week. Dorian ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then, as he sat down, he heard something else. He's just another violent thug. The words were soft, but not soft enough. Dorian turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she smelled something bad, looked away when she realized he'd heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. But he didn't regret it. Bryce had gone looking for a fight. Dorian just made sure he got one. Still, the weight of it all sat on him. He had spent years training, years controlling himself, years walking away. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? But Dorian was about to learn that real strength wasn't just about throwing a punch. It was about what came next. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Bryce still hadn't shown up. His friends didn't bother Dorian anymore. The stares faded a little. The whispers got quieter. But something still hung in the air. Dorian could feel it. One afternoon, as he left the gym, Coach Harrison called him over. Got a minute? Dorian hesitated. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture. But something in the coach's tone made him stop. They walked outside, standing near the track where the football team was finishing practice. I heard what happened, Coach said. Figured you had your reasons. Dorian nodded. He wasn't about to apologize. Coach studied him. You a fighter? Dorian shrugged. Been boxing since I was a kid. Coach let out a low whistle. Yeah, that much was obvious. You're good. But let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything? Dorian looked at him, unsure where this was going. Coach crossed his arms. You think Bryce learned something? Think the rest of them did? Dorian exhaled, running a hand over his head. He knew the answer. Bryce wasn't the type to reflect. And as for the others, some respected him now, some feared him, and some would always see him the way they wanted to, no matter what he did. Coach nodded like he could see the thoughts running through Dorian's head. Thing is, people like Bryce, they don't really lose. Not in a way that sticks. He'll come back, he'll run his mouth, and the cycle starts again. But you're different. You have control. Dorian frowned. What are you saying? Coach tilted his head toward the field. I've been telling the boxing coach to send me a few kids for wrestling. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use? Dorian blinked. Wrestling? Coach grinned. Look, I know you can handle yourself. That much is obvious. But there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power. I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not to be messed with. Now prove there's more to you than that. Dorian didn't answer right away. For so long, fighting had been about survival, about standing his ground. But the way Coach was looking at him, the way he spoke, it wasn't about proving something. It was about being more. That night, Dorian sat on his bed, staring at his uncle's old boxing gloves. He thought about all the times he had held back, all the times he had walked away, and the one time he hadn't. Coach was right. Bryce wouldn't change. People would think what they wanted. But Dorian still had a choice. And maybe, just maybe this time, he'd make a different one. Because real strength wasn't just about knowing when to fight. It was about knowing what to fight for. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Life's full of choices. And sometimes, the hardest one is deciding who you want to be. Let's talk about it in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? How did you handle it? Let's keep the conversation going.